Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing some interesting news pertaining to the San Jose Sharks coming out of the NHL today, and that is that forward Tomas Hertl has been suspended for 2 games following his infraction against the Calgary Flames, and more specifically Elias Lindholm, last night. Now, before we get into whether or not this was a deserved penalty or suspension, we do need to describe exactly what happened. Now, it occurred in the early parts of the third period of that game. In fact, right at the beginning of the third period on the opening draw, Hertl and Lindholm line up for the face-off. The puck is dropped. Lindholm delivers a few cross-checks to the body of Hertl, and in retaliation, Hertl aggressively and intentionally swings his stick at the face of Elias Lindholm. He ends up getting called for a 2-minute high-sticking penalty, and this ends up really costing the Sharks dearly in this game. A 2-1 deficit turns into a 5-1 deficit within just a minute of time or so, minute and a half, and the Sharks get a winnable-ish game, turns to a completely lost game very quickly because of this undisciplined move from Hertl. Now, while it only ends up being that 2-minute penalty, it does end up landing Hertl with a hearing, and he is given a 2-game suspension. Now, the question, of course, becomes, was this suspension actually deserved? And my answer is yes, but sort of. Now, the reason that I say yes is that I do think this was a, extremely retaliatory, high-sticking, very intentional, and this is something that the NHL definitely does want to get rid of. And now, while Hertl doesn't necessarily have much of a history with the Department of Player Safety, no prior suspensions and not even any prior fines either, 2 games may be slightly heavy-handed, but still not the end of the world, and is actually rather similar to a earlier suspension dished out this year. So I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that in a vacuum. My major problem comes with why exactly Hertl actually ends up retaliating on this play. And it is even mentioned, funnily enough, in the video describing Hertl's suspension that the NHL put out. They mention how at the opening draw, Lindholm and Hertl engage in an altercation, and Lindholm delivers multiple cross-checks to Hertl. This is a situation where, especially with the NHL cracking down on cross-checking as of late, you would expect Lindholm to potentially, at the very least, get some sort of penalty call at this point, and because that there wasn't one, Hertl felt he needed to take it into his own hands and ended up taking this undisciplinary retaliation penalty. But it's just, even with the NHL cracking down on cross-checking like they said, it feels as though there are so many scrums off of the face-off and in front of the net and in the corners, where the referees just sort of say, you know what, there are so many cross-checking happening, we can't really call each and every one of them, so we'll just allow it. And it's only really the particularly egregious ones where the player falls over and is lying on the ice that actually end up getting called, and these more minor ones where the player is still being able to stand up and take it in that sort of way, where they're just sort of ignored. So yes, Hertl should not be retaliating in this way, but the fact is that these are cross-checks that just go completely uncalled. Now, generally, we have seen thus far this year a certain level of frustration coming from Tomas Hertl, which is relatively interesting because obviously the San Jose Sharks are not a playoff team, and that must be frustrating for a player who does want to compete, and in the earlier parts of his career did frequently make trips to the playoffs and to the Stanley Cup Finals and the Western Conference Finals. But then Hertl had the opportunity to leave San Jose just last season. He was an unrestricted free agent. He could have gone literally anywhere he wanted to if he had just waited to July 1st, but instead he re-signed with San Jose, so he knew exactly what he was getting into. He should have been able to know that within the first couple of years of his contract, this team was not going to be particularly competitive, or at least the chances of them being particularly competitive were very low, and so he really shouldn't get all that frustrated because this is kind of an expected outcome, or at the very least it should have been an expected outcome. So hopefully these couple of games off will allow Hertl to maybe cool off a bit and get a bit of a more stable head on his shoulders, and maybe be able to come back and continue his relatively torrid pace that he was on offensively at the very least, and maybe find a bit more consistency in his game as well. Class dismissed.